Hollywood has seen many unforgettable duos, but few captured lightning in a bottle the way Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis did. Together, they were unstoppable, packing nightclubs from coast to coast, dominating radio and television, and lighting up movie screens like no one else. Audiences couldn't get enough of their unique chemistry. Dean's smooth, laid-back charm, paired with Jerry's outrageous energy, created magic in motion. They were more than comedy partners. They were best friends, almost like brothers. But the world didn't see the whole story. Behind the curtain, cracks began to form quiet tension that grew until it could no longer be ignored. Then, without warning, everything collapsed. At the height of their fame, the most beloved comedy team in America split with no explanation. No press release, just silence. What could have gone so wrong? What finally shattered their bond beyond repair? The truth was more personal and painful than anyone imagined, and it changed both of their lives forever. Before the fame, before the sold-out shows and flashing cameras, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis were simply two struggling entertainers trying to survive in a tough business. Dean was a nightclub singer with a velvet voice and effortless cool. Jerry was a high-energy comic who mimed records on stage and dreamed of making people laugh. In 1945, fate brought them together at the Glass Hat Club in New York City, where they were performing separately. Their first real collaboration happened almost by accident the following year at the 500 Club in Atlantic City. The owner was ready to fire them both for poor performance. As a last-ditch effort, Dean and Jerry improvised a new act, mixing Dean's smooth crooning with Jerry's manic slapstick. The crowd went wild. Overnight, they became a phenomenon. Word spread quickly. This duo was different. They weren't just funny, they were electric. Their rise was swift. They landed radio spots, filled theaters, and soon began headlining Hollywood films. In 1949, their first movie, My Friend Irma, launched them into mainstream stardom. Studios pushed to sign them. Fans lined up for autographs. Everything they touched seemed to succeed. But the real secret was their contrasting, as the calm, collected straight man, and Jerry as the whirlwind of chaos. Together, they were the perfect storm. Offstage, they seemed equally close, spending holidays together, traveling as a pair, constantly praising each other. To the world, they were inseparable. But the brighter the spotlight grew, the more pressure built behind the scenes. As their fame expanded, so did expectations. Dean and Jerry were no longer just a nightclub act. They had become an entertainment empire. Between 1949 and 1956, they starred in 16 films, each more successful than the last. They hosted radio shows, appeared on television, and drew such enormous crowds that police often had to control the streets outside their venues. They were making millions, but they were also becoming trapped in roles that would ultimately drive them apart. The public couldn't get enough of Jerry Lewis. His youthful energy and unpredictable antics made him the standout. Critics called him a comic genius and the future of comedy. Dean, meanwhile, began to feel overshadowed. Though he was the voice, the charm, the glue of the act, audiences increasingly treated him as the other guy. That imbalance began to hurt. Dean was an experienced performer who valued respect for his talent. Yet reporters often directed questions to Jerry or referred to the duo as Jerry Lewis and his partner. Fans screamed louder for Jerry. Writers tailored scripts to Jerry's style. The films centered more and more on Jerry's slapstick. While Jerry thrived, Dean quietly grew resentful. He never voiced it publicly, but those close to them noticed the shift. Dean began arriving late to rehearsals and leaving early, gradually pulling away from the friendship that had once kept them grounded. Meanwhile, Jerry started taking creative control directing scenes, suggesting edits, even influencing casting further, widening the divide between them. Something in Jerry's behavior finally crossed a line for Dean. What had once felt like a partnership was starting to resemble a dictatorship. And although Dean never made a public scene, the tension between them grew heavier with each passing day. By 1956, their rift was too wide to hide. They kept performing, smiling for photographers, and pretending everything was fine. But behind the veneer were cold glances, short exchanges, and a quiet bitterness that everyone tiptoed around. Then came Dean's birthday, and Jerry decided to make a grand gesture. He threw an extravagant party, inviting friends, colleagues, and Hollywood insiders. Cameras were rolling, the press was watching, and in the middle of it all, Jerry presented Dean with an expensive gold watch engraved with the words, "To Dean, my pal of pals, Jerry." It was designed to be touching, a sentimental reminder of their bond. But instead of gratitude, Dean responded with a cold, blank stare. In front of everyone, he muttered something dismissive. Some witnesses recalled him saying, "You can keep it," while others remembered him simply walking away without acknowledging the gift. Whatever the exact words, the message was undeniable. Dean didn't want the watch, and he didn't want the spectacle Jerry was putting on. To him, it felt fake, another forced piece of publicity rather than genuine affection. That brief moment laid their fractured relationship bare. Jerry, stunned and embarrassed, tried to laugh it off, but there was no undoing the damage. The party became the emotional breaking point. Years of frustration, jealousy, and resentment boiled over. Dean felt overshadowed, used, and pushed aside. Jerry felt attacked, hurt, and bewildered. From that day on, whatever friendship they had left evaporated. They still had a final film to complete, but emotionally, Dean had already stepped away. By the summer of 1956, it was clear the split wasn't a matter of if, but when. The two were finishing their last contractual obligation together, a movie called Hollywood or Bust. What should have been a triumphant conclusion to a legendary partnership instead turned into a tense, silent standoff. On set, they barely spoke unless the cameras were rolling. Gone were the inside jokes and bursts of laughter. In their place was a quiet professionalism, masking deep exhaustion. Crew members later described the atmosphere as cold and strained. Dean filmed his scenes and immediately disappeared from the set. Jerry, ever the perfectionist, poured himself into the work, perhaps hoping the spark could be revived, but Dean had already made his decision. The man who once considered Jerry a brother now saw him as a burden, a spotlight stealer who had twisted their act into something he no longer recognized. On July 24th, 1956, exactly 10 years after their first performance together, Dean Martin walked away. There was no announcement, no goodbye tour, no heartfelt final statement. There was just a quiet last show at the Copacabana in New York City. When the curtain closed, Dean left the stage and never returned to the act. Fans were shocked. Reporters scrambled for explanations, but the duo said nothing at all. There were no interviews, no joint statements, just silence. Speculation ran wild. Creative differences, clashing egos, disputes over money. But those who had seen the slow unraveling up close knew it was far more personal than that. Jerry was devastated. He later admitted to crying for days, mourning not just the act, but the loss of someone he genuinely loved. Dean, on the other hand, buried the past and moved forward, focusing on his solo career and distancing himself from the chaos and emotional fallout their partnership had become. Just like that, one of the most iconic duos in entertainment history disappeared without a single goodbye. After the split, the silence between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis was absolute. For the next 20 years, they inhabited the same entertainment world, crossed paths with the same people, and shared countless memories, but they never spoke. Their once unbreakable bond was sealed off by pride, hurt, and years of unspoken resentment. Jerry never stopped hoping for a reconciliation. In interviews, he sometimes expressed sadness or regret, calling Dean my brother or my other half. He reached out through letters and mutual friends, but Dean never responded. Some insiders claim Dean refused to even look at photos of their time together, removing every picture of Jerry from his home. Whether literal or exaggerated, the message was clear. Dean had shut the door for good. Jerry poured himself into solo success, becoming a director, producer, and star of his own films. But privately, he carried the weight of the split. He missed Dean not just as a partner, but as a friend. Dean, in contrast, rarely mentioned Jerry. When asked, he would give a short, detached answer and swiftly change the subject, keeping his pain behind a wall of cool indifference. Fans never gave up hope. Reunion rumors surfaced throughout the 1960s and 70s. Offers for comeback tours and television specials reportedly came with staggering sums. But Dean refused every one. Whatever had been broken, he had no interest in repairing it. To the public, it might have seemed like a tale of ego versus emotion. But those who knew them understood it was more complicated. A tragedy of two men who loved each other deeply, but were too proud and too hurt to find their way back. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the unthinkable happened. On Labor Day weekend in 1976, Jerry Lewis was hosting his annual telethon, a cause he had championed for years. Millions watched live, expecting comedy, celebrities, and heartfelt appeals for charity. What they did not expect was the return of Dean Martin. Frank Sinatra, a mutual friend, orchestrated the surprise behind the scenes. Without telling Jerry, Frank walked onto the stage mid-show and casually brought out Dean. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Jerry's jaw dropped. He stood there, stunned, blinking in disbelief. Dean, ever composed, offered a sly grin and said, "You're working." The crowd erupted. Cameras captured Jerry laughing, then tearing up. The two hugged. It was awkward. It was emotional. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed like everything might be okay again. But despite the smiles and applause, the reunion was mostly symbolic. After that night, they only spoke a handful of times in private. There was no long conversation, no heartfelt apology, no return to the friendship they had once shared. The wounds were too deep, and too much time had passed. Over the years, Jerry continued to speak of Dean with admiration and sorrow. In one interview, he said, "He was my friend. I loved him. I always will." Dean, ever guarded, rarely opened up. But those closest to him said he was quietly moved by the reunion, even if he never expressed it aloud. When Dean's son, Dean Paul Martin, tragically died in a plane crash in 1987, Jerry reached out privately to offer condolences. And when Dean himself passed away in 1995, Jerry was heartbroken, calling it one of the saddest days of his life. He later told reporters, "There was no one like Dean. He was my partner, my brother, and a part of me always missed him." It was not a storybook ending, but it was human, raw, imperfect, and real. The story of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis is one of comedy, charisma, and undeniable chemistry, but also of pride, pain, and mischances. Together, they built a legacy that shaped American entertainment. They rose from obscurity to superstardom in record time, fueled by talent, timing, and a friendship that felt larger than life. For a decade, they made the world laugh, but behind the spotlight, their personal bond quietly crumbled. In the end, no single event destroyed their friendship. No one fight, no dramatic betrayal. It was something subtler, yet more devastating: ego, the pressures of fame, years of feeling unappreciated, unheard, and misunderstood. The birthday party, the final film, the 20 years of silence were symptoms of a deeper divide that had been growing long before the cameras stopped rolling. Their brief, bittersweet reunion gave fans a measure of closure, but it could never fully repair the damage. They loved each other deeply, and perhaps that made the loss all the more painful. In some ways, they were too proud to admit how much they missed one another, and by the time they might have, it was already too late. Still, their story endures, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of how fragile even the strongest bonds can be. Behind every laugh they shared on stage was a complex relationship few ever fully understood. Dean and Jerry gave the world something timeless. Even if they could not hold on to it themselves, then perhaps that is the most human part of it all.